Alrighty, thank you so much for joining me for this webinar. I really appreciate it. I know all of us have been spending a lot of time on Zoom and other types of platforms like this, and learning a little bit about myself when it comes to doing presentations and how difficult it is for me to not have any kind of feedback from the audience. So I'm going to do the best as I can with this particular situation, but it's at least for me, it's pretty dramatically different than trying to give a presentation in other settings. But I really appreciate you being here. Welcome into my guest bedroom. This is where I've been holding most of my work activities since COVID-19 has hit. My name is Bill Therrien. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia. And when it comes to CEC divisions, there's not two divisions that I love more than DLD, where I'm president-elect, and then CCBD, where I've been a longtime member. So I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to focus on, knowing everyone's time is short and wanting to leave with something tangible in order to work with children that you might be working with that have difficulties with reading and behavioral issues, or potentially maybe other areas for those that are engaged with research that you might be willing to utilize and do work in. So my goal really for this particular session is have you leave with a straightforward instructional program, one that I've worked with for a long time. I've done some research that you can use right away, and also try to think about how you could potentially use this program virtually for providing instruction to children in a virtual manner, or even trying to think about doing studies in a virtual manner. So with that in mind, I'm gonna move quickly through this material and hopefully leave a lot of time for you all to ask questions. Provide a very, very brief overview of reading challenges for students with LD and EBD. Talk very quickly about components of reading instruction that I think we're all pretty familiar with. Then I'm gonna narrow down on reading fluency remediation, which is one of the areas where I do a lot of my work. And then talk about my particular intervention that we've done some research over the years called Reread, Adapt, Answer, and Comprehend, and kind of walk you through that particular program and see what kind of questions you have and if you're interested in engaging in that. So I think we all know that reading is a real challenge for students with EBD and LD. Of course, when it comes to learning disabilities, difficulties with reading is the primary deficit that about 80% of the students and children have. But also for those of us that work with students with EBD, we know comorbidity with reading disability can be a real challenge. And we know that reading skills, getting some kind of reading skill, get to a certain level and ability to read is really, really, really important when it comes to employment and decreasing chances that individuals can live in poverty and have poor health outcomes. So I think we all know this. Reading is an essential skill. It's absolutely essential for vocational. It's absolutely correlated with poor life outcomes if you don't learn how to read. So we really need to spend a significant amount of time thinking about how we can help individuals with learning disabilities and EBD learn how to read. So typical presentation, I probably spend 3 or 4 more slides on this. I'm going to move forward from it with the idea that we all understand that reading is an important skill and something that we need to work on as teachers and researchers and those that work with kids with LD and EBD. So essential reading components. Gosh, I was preparing to do this presentation and looking back at the National Reading Panel. And I can't believe that it's been almost 20 years since the National Reading Panel came out. This is the time when I was pursuing my PhD at Penn State, and prior to that, working with kids with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disorders. And so this really, the publication of the National Reading Panel really had a big impact on me and really set me along my research trajectory, because I was thinking about the kids that I had worked with, the difficulties that they had with particular reading components, and the way that the National Reading Panel kind of honed in on the current research that was available at that time, and gave us a good indication of areas that we could focus on for children overall, and students with disabilities was pretty seminal. So there's been a lot of additional research, obviously, over the last 20 years, other than the National Reading Panel. But I think when you think about those essential reading components of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension as really being essential for our students and things that we need to focus on. But today I really want to focus on the areas that I've been doing most of my work, and that's reading fluency and reading comprehension. So again, back when I was pursuing my PhD, thought of the kids that I was working with before that, and I really thought reading fluency was such a difficult thing for them. They read in such a slow and halting manner, and reading was just so painful for them. And although I had an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in fields related to education and a master's degree in special education, I'd never actually even heard of reading fluency before. So it was a real aha moment for me back then, and something that I really wanted to spend some time on to see about, were the kids that we're working on, was reading fluency a concern, and how did that impact comprehension? And so I really want to focus on those particular areas and thinking about students that maybe that you work with that have those difficulties. So reading fluency, we really think about three components, right? So it's how quickly they read, combined with accuracy, and that's the one, at least in the literature, that's been most focused on. And then also proper expression, called prosody. So are they reading in a fluent manner? Are they, particularly when it comes to narrative text, are they reading it in a meaningful manner? Are they stopping? Are they reading at a period? Are they saying a sentence with a question mark and an appropriate intonation, and so on and so forth? So really think about those three components as being core to reading fluency. And the theoretical rationale for the importance of reading fluency has been around a long time, and even really before the Burge and Samuels, but they're often credited for the theory of automaticity. And the way they kind of describe it when it comes to reading fluency is that when children are reading a slow and halting manner, or when anyone is, it really impedes the flow of thought. They're spending so much time and cognitive energy trying to decode the text that they really have little time left for comprehension. And when I reflect back on the kids that I've worked on throughout my career, both as a teacher and as a researcher, that usually does significantly limit comprehension. Now, every once in a while, you'll work with a student and they'll read out loud to you, and at least in my experience, I won't even understand what they're saying. I couldn't comprehend what they were saying, and then lo and behold, I'll ask comprehension questions on it, and they'll get everything right. So there are kids who, for whatever reason, reading fluency doesn't hold them back when it comes to comprehending the passages. I would speculate that's probably has to do with a really strong background knowledge. But the vast majority of them, of children we work with, reading fluency is a real hamper to comprehending the particular passage. So it's a necessary prerequisite to comprehending, but it obviously isn't sufficient enough. It's one of the multiple components that individuals need to comprehend a particular passage. Also, it's important to think of fluency when we think about it as situational, based off of a particular text. So you don't have a child or an individual, even ourselves, who gains some kind of fluent ability to read, and then we were able to read everything fluently. It's obviously contextual with the passage that we're reading, the background knowledge that we have on the topic, and so on and so forth. So reading fluency remediation. I thought, okay, well, this obviously is an important skill. This is something that we, as special educators, that we should be able to target, particularly in a supplemental manner, thinking about pulling individuals that are getting their typical reading instruction in the regular education classroom, as children with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disorders often do. So I looked, and I imagine many of you have heard of the program Repeated Reading, and it's really as simple as that sounds. It's a supplemental reading program that consists of rereading short passages into a satisfactory level of fluency to read. So kids are rereading the same passage. Some studies have them read 3 times, sometimes 5 times. Some have them read it until they get to a certain speed. But in general, they're trying to ramp up the ability to read fluency on a particular passage and then moving on to another passage. And this really isn't, when it comes to fluency intervention, there's no other intervention that has as much research as repeated reading. And it was discussed in the National Reading Panel, and a significant amount of research has been done since then. So how does repeated reading work? There's been a lot of theoretical discussions about what is the mechanism that makes it work, because obviously if gains in reading fluency don't transfer to the second passage or to new passages, then repeated reading probably isn't a strategy we want to use. In other words, if we have a student repeatedly read a particular passage, and even if they get faster from the first passage to the fourth passage, when they pick up a novel passage, they don't gain in reading fluency, then we're probably engaging in a practice that at least isn't as efficient or beneficial to the children as we had hoped. So a good friend of mine, Scott Ardoin out of University of Georgia, has been conducting looking at eye scans and see where eyes go when it comes to particular passage reading for students. And so what I have for you here is two different examples. Same child reading a passage two different times. One's the first passage reading, so the first time they've ever seen it, and the second one is the second passage reading. Now, when it comes to, in general, when people think from a theoretical perspective, how does repeated reading work? One hypothesis was, students are starting to understand the way passages are constructed, they're getting used to sentence structure and paragraph structure and so on and so forth. Another theoretical perspective is it's really at the word level. So when children are being exposed or seeing words they don't know, and then they're learning that particular word, then the next time they see that word, they're learning that word, they're to be able to recognize that word by sight or decode that word out before. And what Scott, I think, very eloquently showed through these studies is that when it comes to repeated reading, it's primarily at the word level. So although there's other beneficial aspects of repeated reading when it comes to learning sentence structure and so forth, the main thing that individuals that are engaged in repeated reading are getting is being exposed to words they don't know multiple times in the same passage so they can acquire those words. So if you spend a little bit of time looking at these views of the child reading the word and seeing where their eyes were tracking in the eye track software, you'll notice that in reading one, they really spent a lot of time going back and hovering over words that they didn't know. As time went on, they learned those particular words and they moved further. So in general, and I think it's important to think about this because this is when you think about the kids that you're working on, with the skills that they need to work on and where they are, whether something like repeated reading would be beneficial for them. So it's really the fixation on those low frequency words that decreases over time. And they learn in that particular passage, and then they see it into a subsequent passage and a subsequent passage and a subsequent passage, and it really builds up their fluency at that particular word level. And so this has real implications, in my perspective, on who can benefit from repeated reading. So if you think about from high to low frequency words, in general, when children are reading at a third and fourth, maybe a fifth grade instructional level, they're starting to have difficulty with words that don't occur very frequently. And so when that happens, repeated reading isn't going to be successful. The way repeated reading really helps is when children are learning high frequency words, because there's a good chance for incidental overlap between passages. So you read the first passage, a child reads the first passage, let's say they're approximately at a second grade instructional reading level. They have some difficulty with words in that particular passage. Chances are those words they have difficulty with are high frequency enough that we're going to have incidental overlap in the second passage they read, in the third passage they read, in the fourth passage they read. So I usually recommend, when it comes to repeated reading, that you think about it as a strategy that's meant for kids that are reading between a first and a fourth grade level. Now, I've seen successful studies that have used it with individuals that have higher grade levels. So it might be something you want to try. But in general, I think of that first through fourth grade instructional reading level as being something that repeated reading works for, because of that incidental overlap between passages. And I think Scott's work's really kind of demonstrated why that's really critical. So keep that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about who to utilize repeated reading with, or whatever instructional strategy you decide to use. So essential components of repeated reading, I think they kind of dovetail off of how repeated reading works. So first is you really need a competent tutor. When I first did a review of repeated reading studies a long time ago, one of the conclusions I came to was that adult tutors really needed to be the ones that were engaged in this particular intervention with students. But the more I've thought about it over the years, that's really not the case. There's nothing magical about adults. But adults are more likely to be able to monitor a child's reading when they're reading a passage out loud and provide corrective feedback. So you could use peers to provide that type of feedback, but you're really going to have to teach them to be able to monitor their peers' reading and provide that feedback, at least on word errors. And for someone who's engaged in this work for quite some time, that can be difficult. That can be difficult for adults to do, and it can certainly be difficult for peers to do. So someone who's able to monitor students' oral reading level, reading when they're reading out loud and provide corrective feedback. That corrective feedback should be on, at the very least, word errors. And when we get to the RAC program, I'll show you some other feedback that we typically give. And then I recommend that you utilize a performance criterion to determine how many times a child is going to reread that passage. So a lot of studies will have children read 3 times or 4 times and then stop. My recommendation is that you have children read till they get to a certain level of reading fluency, and then importantly, combined with that, you utilize passages that aren't too difficult or too easy for the child. So when I'm working with children with any kind of reading fluency intervention, my teacher gut comes out, and if I'm asking a child to read a passage 4 times or 5 times, that 4th time or that 5th time, even sometimes depending on the child, that 3rd time, and they start to balk on it, then we're doing something wrong, and we need to utilize a little bit easier material. The goal for these programs is they have difficulty reading fluency the 1st time. Wow, they really get it the 2nd time, and by that 3rd time, I really hope they're nailing it when it comes to reading fluency. Because first of all, I think that's a better learning environment, instructional setting for them. It's not too overwhelming for them, and they can feel that impact, that improvement in that reading fluency, and it can be very motivating for them. Along with those, some other potential beneficial aspects that has been shown in the literature. One's modeling, so reading it out loud to the student before they read it. I think that's often a valuable technique to use, and then the children kind of hear how fluent reading sounds, particularly that proper expression prosody aspect of it, and then charting their progress can be a real motivational portion of the program as well. Okay, so what's the evidence base for repeated reading? I think it's pretty clear that it increases speed and accuracy. It certainly does it within passages, and there's pretty good research out there that shows it increases over time on novel passages measured through things like oral reading fluency. There's mixed impact on comprehension, and in my perspective on that, comprehension is really a composite skill related to reading fluency and text monitoring and background knowledge and vocabulary knowledge. So when we think about providing kind of supplemental instruction, comprehension, particularly when we think about it from a norm reference assessment, is a hard nut to crack unless you provide extensive long-term intervention. Students with emotional behavior disorder, there actually hasn't been, the last I looked, there hasn't been that much research with repeated reading and individuals with EBD, but when it was done, there's similar results out there for them, where they are improving in reading fluency and sometimes improving in comprehension. And importantly, a lot of the authors who engaged in this work looked at the impact on behavior, and it wasn't always explicitly viewed as a dependent variable, but the authors reported minimal disruptions. They reported that the children preferred and that individual attention they often get, because repeated reading is often one-on-one. They like seeing their reading improve, and they like that immediate feedback. So, if you're working with individuals that have some significant behavioral problems, you may have to add some kind of behavioral component, obviously, but the one-on-one attention, and if you really hone in on appropriate passages and make them intense short-term sessions where these children see that they're improving dramatically, and potentially charting that, I think it can be a very positive experience where you won't see as many behavioral disruptions as maybe you see at different times of the day. So what's missing from repeated reading programs? It's a pretty powerful program, I think, when it comes to focusing directly on reading fluency. But my concerns with the program, at least by itself, how repeated reading is typically done, is, first of all, it really only focuses on automaticity, and automaticity is the 2 legs of a 3-leg stool. It's it's speed and accuracy, but it's no proper expression. So, because you're usually reading and they really get trained to kind of read as fast as they can. And it really, when it comes down, it's really speed even more than accuracy, based off of how things are timed. Also, there's really typically no explicit focus on comprehension. So a lot of these programs, kids read a passage for a minute and they stop. It doesn't matter where they were in that particular passage. They just stop, and then they start at the beginning. They read for another minute and stop. Again, doesn't matter where they were. And then they read for another minute and then they stop, and they move forward. And this always bothered me, because it really seemed like a missed opportunity to work on comprehension. And it also worried me what kids kind of inferred about the purpose of reading. I mean, who reads a passage up to a certain point and stops and goes back and rereads it and never actually comprehends the whole particular passage? So it seems like a real missed opportunity to work on comprehension. And it also, I think, gives students the wrong impression about reading, what reading's about. So I really worried about that as being a missed opportunity. So that's why over the years we developed a program that's repeated reading based, but included some of these other components called reread, adapt, and answer, and comprehension. And so let me talk a little bit about that this program and kind of the thought process of how we put it together. So we based it primarily on that repeated reading. So passages are read out loud, corrective feedback on word errors is provided, but we also add proper expression. And passages are read to a performance criterion, so I utilize that. But then we also added the inclusion of a comprehension strategy. Now, we utilize question generation to be procedural prompts to kind of guide students' comprehension of the particular passage they were utilizing. I would say if you're working with children and they're using some kind of comprehension strategy, utilize that comprehension strategy. You're more than welcome to use question generation. We've had some good success with it. But if they're utilizing some other comprehension strategy in their school, in their classroom, or that you've taught them, just embed that within this program. There's nothing magical about using question generation. It's just what we decided to utilize. As I had said, typical repeated reading programs typically focusing on speed and accuracy and no proper expression or prosody. So what we did with this is we actually added a rubric. This rubric was adapted from the National Center for Education Statistics in a report they have about listening to children read out loud. And basically, it categorizes the reading into 4 different levels. From the 4th level is the most fluent level, says things like, I read most of the story in long, meaningful phrases. I repeated or missed only a few words. I emphasized important words or phrases, and I read with expression. So our goal with this in the beginning is we're providing children feedback on how they're reading. And rating them and letting them know how we rated them while they're going through the RAC program. Later on, ideally, children are actually taking this and thinking about how well they're reading the passage fluently and how they're engaging with the material. So the goal here is to say, hey, it's not just about speed and accuracy. It's also very much about how you're reading that particular passage. Does it sound like something that a fluent reader, how a fluent reader would read it? And again, this is a good time to think about providing some of those modeling, particularly if your children are having trouble reading fluently. We also created passages for this program, and that instead of like just taking passages off the shelf or taking very long passages that children couldn't read entirely in a short period of time, we developed short passages that can contain complete narratives, so that even the first time a child reads this particular passage, they can read through the whole thing. And then ideally, by the time they get to the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th passage reading, they're able to read it as fluently as children with that same instructional reading level is. So these are short passages. You can kind of see on the right-hand side how long they are. And the goal here is to make sure these children are able to read the entire passage. And because they're reading the entire passage and reading the entire passage multiple times, we can go ahead and engage in some of those comprehension strategies, and we can make it explicit to the children that, hey, reading is about comprehension. We're working on reading fluency, but we're also thinking about how to comprehend this particular passage. We also used question generation, and we have 2 versions of this program. I'll get to the other one a little bit later, but the first one that I did most of my research on was using narrative passages. And so since they were narrative passages, we utilize story structure prompts. Who is the main character? Where and when did the story take place? What did the main character do? And so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, with these question generation prompts, depending on the passage that the children are reading, will indicate whether these questions are factual questions or inferential questions. So that can be fascinating to watch kids try to answer these particular prompts based on the passage they read when the material isn't necessarily in that particular passage and they have to infer it. So who is this particular intervention for? Again, I want you to go back and think about how repeated reading works. It really is at the word level. So I typically recommend it for 1st through 4th grade instructional reading level. Now that doesn't mean 1st through 4th grade students. I've utilized it and others that I've worked with have utilized it with post-secondary students with intellectual disabilities. We've even had a lot of deaf, we have several studies with deaf students who've engaged in it with some modifications, obviously. So, but think about that. Sometimes when I would present this material to school districts, particularly principals, they would really want to engage with a repeated reading and a RAC intervention with children who really wasn't appropriate with. So high school kids reading at a 6th, 7th, 8th grade level. And although there's been some studies that show that can be successful, I'm not quite sure it's the right program to utilize for them. Also, make sure you monitor students' progress. So although there's a lot of evidence for these types of programs, they don't work for everyone. I know that firsthand, both as a teacher and working with this program as a researcher. If they're not gaining on an oral reading fluency measure that you're collecting weekly or bi-weekly, such as DIBELS or Ames-Webb, then you're gonna have to think about particular modifications. So irregardless of whether it seems like it's something that's effective, if you see little or no improvement, make a change. It's not the program for them. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the implementation guidelines for the RAC program, and I think in general it's pretty straightforward. And the first step in the intervention steps is to remind the students to read the story the best you can and as quickly as you can, but pay attention to what you're reading as you would need to answer these questions. So in this particular prompt, particularly in the beginning when children haven't been working with us for very long, our key here is children often do what we want them to do, so we're trying to make it very explicit. So it's not just read as best and quickly as you can, but really we want you to pay attention to what you're reading because we're going to be trying to comprehend it. And this is when we actually would cue to the reading, to the cue card questions. This could be these cue card questions for if you're using question generation, or this could be whatever comprehension strategy that maybe you're engaging with them. So this is very easily adaptable. There's no reason you have to use question generation if you have some other strategy. In fact, I recommend against it. If you're using summarization or some other comprehension strategy, go ahead and infuse that in here. In the beginning, I would have the kids read these out loud. So before they read the passage for the first time, they would read through these particular questions, and I would remind them that we were going to try to answer these questions when we were done. After we move through the program for a period of time, if you think about engaging with a repeated reading program, let's say for 50 sessions, so getting around session 5 through 10, certainly by session 15, children really know what you're looking for, and so I just prompt them, hey, don't forget, we have these story structure questions, we have these cue card questions that we're going to be answering after you read the passage. So simple opening. Then we have them reread the passage until they reach a goal. Now remember, we have these short passages and we have goals set on norms reported by Hasbrock and Tyndall. So our goal is to get them at the 50th percentile for that instructional reading level. So no matter how well they read that particular passage, I have them read it 2 times. So even if they do a phenomenal job that first time, I always have them read it 2 times. But I never have them read it more than 4 times. With that idea of that teacher gut feeling of some of these repeated reading studies that I've read, they're having kids read a passage 16, 17, 18 times. And I don't find that to be appropriate. I don't think it's beneficial academically for that particular student. So again, the goal here is get them in a passage that's at a difficulty level where it's a little bit of trouble that first time. Second time, wow, they're getting way better. And by that 4th time, they've definitely had it. And if they don't, then we got to think about using easier or harder materials. For error correction during these rereading, this is really up to you based off of how you're providing error correction for students. At the very least, provide simple word error correction, keeping in mind that repeated reading works at the word level. Correct the word and have the student repeat it if they pause for 3 seconds during reading, and then correct all other word errors that they have after the passage is read. And that's the simple procedures that we've used in most of our studies, and when we've used, particularly when we're using folks that don't have an education background to engage in this. We're recording how they're doing each time, and when you see the passages, there's a particular goal that's there related to how quickly they read it and how many errors they make. So once they reach that particular goal within that time frame, that 2 to 4, we would stop with that particular passage. We provide feedback to the students on improvements in speed and accuracy and proper expression. And I've utilized this different ways. Sometimes I'll do it after every reading. Sometimes I'll do it maybe twice during the session if they read it 4 times. But certainly at least once during that particular rereading of that passage, you're going to engage in this "how did I read" rubric. Similar to the story structure prompts, how you're going to utilize this as you go through the program is going to change. So in the beginning, you're going to provide a lot of this assessment. I think you read at the 3rd grade level because the 3rd level because of this, and this, or in the beginning, the first time you read it, I really saw you were having difficulty. You weren't really reading with expression. You were missing, having a lot of difficulty going word by word instead of reading in a fluent manner. But at the end, when you read it the 4th time, I was really impressed with how you read it in long, meaningful phrases, how you read with expression, so on and so forth. And really, for this, it's pretty evident to the students if they're improving in speed, particularly, and accuracy to a great extent as they're reading and as you're giving feedback on the correct words per minute that they're reading, that you're calculating. So I really focus this on, this obviously those skills are embedded in this "how do I read" rubric, but I really focus this on that prosody element of reading fluency, that, hey, look, we need to read this like a fluent reader would read it, and really pay attention to that. Okay, so you engage in that. The next step is you prompt students to adapt and answer the cue card questions. I only do this once. So after they've gotten to that particular fluency level, you would go through that particular cue card question. And if you have a lot of experience working with children and reading, you don't necessarily have to follow the error correction process that I have here. But if you're maybe using a paraprofessional or somebody else who doesn't have as much experience, I would recommend that you kind of show them this is the way, a potential way that they could correct students through this particular sequence. So, if they have difficulty the first time, I'll typically prompt them to go back and see if they can find it in the passage. If it's not correct the second time, I might point to where they could find the answer. And if it's not correct the 3rd time, I provide the answer and point to where it can be found. Now, when it comes to inferential questions, obviously, it's not going to be able to point to where it can be found in one specific instance. So I generally point to something that's going to give them a clue of an idea of what might be the answer to that particular item. After we're finished with that, with this material, I also have comprehension questions. And this is, so the story structure prompts is you're still engaged in instruction. And then the comprehension questions, at that point, put the passage away and I ask comprehension questions. The comprehension questions are 4 inferential and 4 factual questions. And then after I record that, we're finished, the session ends. Typically these sessions for me last anywhere from, if you include setup and take down and taking the child back to the classroom, it's no more than 15 minutes. It's a pretty short intervention session, particularly as they get used to the process of engaging with that. After you're done the session, this is a critical part of the program where we're adjusting the difficulty of the material. So the material I have for this program is kindergarten through 6th grade instructional passages, roughly. And so we really want to keep students in that zone where they're having some difficulty with some other words in the passage, but they're improving pretty dramatically. So I have a rule that says, if 3 sessions in a row, the student was unable to reach the pre-established number of correct words per minute in 4 readings, then we lower the material, make it a little bit easier. And if you start in the beginning, the students are really getting frustrated, I wouldn't even wait 3 sessions in a row. I would go ahead and lower it, use your teacher intuition. But if for 3 sessions in a row, they're able to reach that pre-established number of correct words per minute in 2 readings or less, then I raise it up. And typically I find, across 50 sessions that most students end up increasing at least the difficulty of the passages that they're utilizing in when it comes to the program. So this is a real key part about if you're going to have children work on reading fluency and you don't want them reading passages 15 times, of controlling that difficulty so they're having to read at least 2 times, but not so much that it becomes frustrating. Last thing I do is record the passage to be used in the next session, so that they made that if they've improved 3 passages in a row and they were able to get read fluently in 1 or 2 passage readings, and I'd say, okay, we're on the 3rd grade instructional level material. Next session, I'm going to move up to the 4th grade instructional material. So I have, I hope that makes sense, and we'll get to questions soon, hopefully. But I do have available resources here and material that I'm more than happy to make available to you. The first thing that I have for you, if you are interested, is all these particular materials. So I have kind of a prompt sheet that goes through exactly what I just talked about when it comes to the intervention steps. I have the question generation prompts if you decide to utilize those. I have that how do I read sheet so that you can utilize that. I do think that's an essential part, even if you do change out the comprehension strategy. And then I have some sample passages. I also have a whole set of passages if you're interested in them, but you can kind of see I have two versions of the same passage. One is the teacher's version, and you can see we have time, errors, and a rubric score, and a typical goal for the student. So, I want them to get to a 4 on the rubric. I don't want them to make many errors, and we have a goal time for this particular passage of 1 minute and 5 seconds. And then we have the comprehension questions, and you can see which ones are inferential and factual here as well. And then there is a companion story for the student where they go ahead and read that as well. There's also some material about this program and some examples of it on a website. We had developed an app for the RAC. We're actually redeveloping that right now and trying to add some particular features to it. So I don't believe it's available on the Apple Store at this point. But the website's still up and running. And we have several examples of individuals working with children when it comes to the RAC intervention. This was an earlier iteration. I'm not sure if it included the prosody component to it, the feedback. But I think if you kind of watch the particular video, you can see kind of where that would fit in and how that would be helpful. And then I also have for you available on an open access box drive all the intervention material and all the reading material that we've engaged with these particular programs. So there are some modifications that you can think about utilizing. One is, instead of using narrative text, using nonfiction text, expository text. And if you do that, if you're interested in that, I have some passages related to that too. We've developed some passages primarily in sciences. That's another interest of mine. And one thing we know from the research is that children are often not exposed to expository passages in an early enough age or developmental level. So it's something you might want to consider. For the comprehension component of that, for the RAC, we use just pure who, what, where, why, when prompts, but you certainly can use another comprehension strategy within that. It's also prosody when it comes to expository text is a little bit different. So you might want to think about modifying the rubric slightly. But we've had some luck for it. Another thing to consider is how important passage repetition really is for reading fluency. There's been some studies that have been done that really find that there doesn't seem to be a significant difference between reading out loud a particular passage and then moving on to another passage, provided that you're controlling for the difficulty, as opposed to rereading one passage 3 times and moving on to another passage. So Rolando O'Connor conducted a particular study. There were several studies in the 90s. I have one particular study as well that shows, if you control the difficulty, you might not have to do that rereading. It certainly doesn't hurt. There's much more research when it comes to the repeated reading aspect of it. But at least to me, it's a compelling argument to think about, well, if we just focus on a particular reading level, and we only have them read it once, they're going to be exposed to a lot more background knowledge and topics over time than rereading a particular passage. So something to consider, and if you're making sure that your progress monitoring with the student is something that might work, and you can just have them read it one time. Same rules would confer when it comes to changing passages. I would try to be at an instructional reading level where they could be fluent or close to fluent on that first particular passage reading. Another idea is grouping students for fluency instruction, and this can particularly work if you first provide a model and then have students take turns reading fluent and providing each other's feedback. I really still think it's most powerful if you do it one-on-one, just based off of my experience. But if you're looking to group children for instruction and you're not able to do it one-on-one or have a paraprofessional engage with students with this, which is a way that I've done a lot of my work, then you might want to think about grouping students, and it could be utilized for that too, provided that they're at the relatively the same instructional reading level. Include goal setting and graphing. I think particularly for individuals where motivation might be a factor, this is a real explicit way to make it evident and open of what they're working on and how they're improving. And then I was thinking through this, thinking about our situation where we're providing instruction virtually to children in home environments. This can be very easily adapted to provide instruction during some kind of web or Zoom application. So you provide the story to the child ahead of time. Above, you have them share their particular screen so you can see them read it loud. You provide them feedback, and you go through the protocol. And what's nice about it is we're talking a very short period of time that you're working with the child, 15 minutes, where you really need their undivided attention, and hopefully they'll have that motivation because they're seeing that improvements in their reading fluency over that particular time. Again, when it comes to this program, most of the time when I'm working with them through an intervention protocol, particularly if I'm just sticking with narrative passages, no more than 50 sessions typically is what I'm engaging with over a period of time. You can see significant results. There is, I wanted to make sure I provide you with studies with more info. I talked about Scott's work. I think his work is very interesting, particularly his eye tracking work and how he kind of looks at repeated reading and how it's actually functioning. And then also I have some papers on this if you want to look at some particular research. And it's not just individuals with learning disabilities and emotional behavior disorders that we've had success with this particular program. As I indicated, we have a pretty large cadre of studies with deaf readers where it was adapted at the Michigan School for the Deaf, and also individuals with intellectual disabilities. Again, to me, it really is that instructional reading level that they're working on that's important. So I got a couple next steps for you to consider. One, for those of you that are practitioners, that I'd like you to do is, here's the material, take it and use it. Make sure you monitor improvement in reading achievement for your children and students that you're working with, and make sure that it's making a difference. But this material has been developed, so hopefully you can utilize it in a way that can help your children. If you have any questions when you're engaging with that, if you want a refresher, feel free to email me. Sometimes even simple programs like this, you think, okay, yeah, I got this. It seems like pretty straightforward. And then you sit down to do it and you end up having 1,000 different questions. I'm more than happy to correspond with you via email or get on another Zoom call. You can also see we have several teacher practitioner papers on the rack. I think that can help you engage with that. For those of you that are researchers, yeah, take and use this as well. You can use it on your own, but if you wanted to, I'd be more than happy to collaborate with you on it as well. There's a lot of different ways that this can be modified and looked at to see if it's effective for the children that we care about the most, children with learning disabilities and emotional behavior disorders. And I also think I have one colleague at University of Texas, Austin, who is not Austin, University of Texas, Dallas, I believe, who is actually utilizing it for a study via distance. So It's something that you can utilize. Think about changing the comprehension component. Think about looking about whether repetition is important, and so on and so forth. I think, can be pretty powerful, but there's still a lot of research questions that can be asked about it. So that's what I have for you. I told you I would run through it quickly. I hope it's something that you'll be interested in using, and I'd open it up for questions that you have.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Therrien. So we do have a couple questions that I've seen so far. People, if you have any additional questions, feel free to either ask them through the chat or the Q&A, and I'll kind of help monitor some of those for you as well. So one of the first questions was, what if a student refuses to reread in order to to make the correction for an error that they may have made?
So I've had children balk at rereading for sure. I find that it typically happens when I'm asking them to reread that particular passage. And so, I mean, if you get in that particular situation and that's the case, then my recommendation would be use easier material and start there and try to build up for success, and really try to make it explicit that, and to show the child how much that they're gaining in that particular skill. But yeah, that's a problem, particularly when you're working with kids with behavioral difficulties where, you know, either maybe this program's not right for them, they find it aversive to have to reread particular passages, and at that point, probably not something beneficial, or you're gonna have to put in some kind of external behavioral program that's specifically engaged at compliant behavior and engaging with the material.
Okay, excellent. Athlia, I'm sorry if I butcher that, Allie. Thank you, Allie. She said one of the things she kind of said was being in a small group kind of setting. You know, a child might be embarrassed if they make a mistake within that small group setting, and so they don't do the reread.
Yeah. Oh, I could totally see that. And that's kind of can be the powerful thing with doing it one-on-one. And at least in a lot of my experience, where I was fortunate to have schools that had paraprofessionals, and oftentimes the paraprofessionals didn't feel like they were being utilized for the instructional needs of the children. They were engaged in tasks for the teacher when it comes to you know, one-on-one monitoring of behavior or copying things on the copy machine, so on and so forth. So I've had really good luck at using paraprofessionals or parent volunteers, and they tend to be very positive about the program because they see differences in the children's reading, and they feel like their time is really being utilized wisely and for the reasons why they decided to volunteer or work in the school to begin with, which is to help kids.
Claudia had asked, have you tried to utilize this strategy with English language learners?
I have not. I think that's a phenomenal idea, and so should give it a try and see how it works. Obviously, you're gonna have to modify a little bit when it comes to the pronunciation concerns, but it could be a great program for that. Yeah. Again, it's that instructional reading level where I think is key.
Excellent. We had a couple questions asking. They're really excited about those resources, and so they wanted to see where those resources would be available. I know previously when we've done these, we've sent not only the video to people who've registered for the seminar, but they also were able to get those via, I believe, an email. Would that be something that we could
Absolutely
look at?
Yeah, so PowerPoint will be available for you. I'll share that with CCBD and DLD. That's not a problem. And I'll also send the link to that material. I have it in a box folder that's just open to the public. So if you have the link, you can download it all.
All right, perfect. Lauren asked, is there research that suggests to use more fictional material versus informational or expository material?
No. There's not. You tend to think about children that are reading at that instructional level where we often target reading fluency, it tends to be narrative text. And there is research that shows that kids, particularly elementary children, are often not exposed to nonfiction text as much as they can, but there isn't a comparison of them. I think the way I utilize the program is I typically start with that narrative text, and then I move on to nonfiction text if I'm working with the child for a long enough period of time, and then eventually, you would likely mix that up and utilize both types.
And then Alyssa had asked, regarding passage selection, can you focus on high interest topics, or is it critical to use a more standard type text?
That's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, the material that we have, I don't know if I would call it high interest. We really focused on that instructional reading level. But obviously, I mean, when it comes to reading, our real goal is try to increase the motivation and find topics that they're interested in. And so when it comes to this particular reading program, if you could develop your own material that would engage students in a motivating topic on top of it, that would just be amazing. If not, think about this as a real kind of fine-tuned, precise 15 minutes that you're working with your child, and you're focusing on these reading fluency and text comprehension skills, and then spend the rest of your time in their comprehensive reading program really trying to engage them in material that they're going to be motivated for. Because the reality is we could go through this repeated reading rack program. We could do it all year. We could do 150 sessions in a particular year. We could really improve their reading fluency and hopefully their efficacy for reading. But if they didn't read outside of school, then we're really going to be stuck. And that's really that's the elephant in the room when it comes to individuals with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disorders. Quite honestly, they've had really, really poor experiences with reading. They hate reading, and a lot of them. And the research shows us that in order to get better at reading, they need to read, and they need to read on their own. And so the only way we're going to get there is we find passages that can be motivating for them, but that can be a real struggle.
Nora had asked about the website that was mentioned for reading strategies. She was asking if you could say what it was again so that they could interact with your materials.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's let me pull it up. It'll be available too on the PowerPoint, and there's nothing phenomenal about it, to be honest with you. But I struggled with wanting to give you an example of what it might look like. Sometimes the easiest way to think about yourself engaging in a program like this, other than me sitting here and reading you the steps, is to say, okay, see how someone else is engaged with this in this particular situation. So this at least gives you an example of someone implementing the RAC intervention with a child.
And Sarah had asked, has the RAC been tested in a context that infuses trauma responsive practices for children with emotional behavioral disorders?
No, not that I know of. So I think it's a great idea. Yep.
Excellent. And then an anonymous attendee asked about, for older students, are there other considerations besides the text types?
Obviously, one thing when it comes to this particular program is, it's a supplemental program. So I would only utilize it as part of a larger comprehensive program when it comes to individuals with emotional behavioral disorders or learning disabilities, and how you're going to kind of approach and teach comprehension and reading to those individuals. So it should be used alone. And sometimes what I'll find with folks that are engaging with it, teachers and principals who have had some success with it, is they want to use it with everyone, and they kind of want to think of it as being like their reading program. And it is certainly not that. It is one small component where hopefully students will experience some success and be able to move on. One thing I would say that maybe is a negative with using this particular program with older kids is, although we don't have balloons and bears and such on our reading passages, some of the lower level reading passages are probably going to seem immature for those particular individuals. And if you have some children that are kind of sensitive to that could be problematic for you.
Okay, I think we answered all the questions that have been posted so far. But if anybody has any additional questions, we can ask those as well. I just wanted to give a little, oh, we got another question.
Oh,
I'll
thank
give
you.
my little reminder. Oh,
Put the link out there for me.
Allie just shared the link with everybody.
Thank
So I'm going to copy that and put that into the chat so other people have it. I'm also going to attach a little post survey at the end of this webinar. If you could fill it out, it helps us kind of shape future webinars just like this one. So we really appreciate everybody coming out, but we can go ahead and keep answering any type of questions that anybody needs as well.
Well, we'll wait to see if anyone has any questions. I want to do a shout out for another event that's happening for CCBD here on May 21st at 8 p.m. With Doctors Hunter and Taylor, who I know both of them very well. Academic intervention for students with challenging behaviors. JT is actually my former postdoc, so he's a great presenter, and so is Dr. Hunter. So hopefully you'll all consider coming to that one as well. All right, well, are you all still there?
I'm still here.
Okay. Worried me. All right, well, it looks like we're done. Thank you so much for spending a little time with me. I hope this is something that that you'll consider utilizing with kids that you're working with, or if you're a researcher, maybe something that you'd be able to infuse in your research program. I'm more than happy to collaborate and share what I have. I mean, that's why we develop material. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. We'll make sure in the email that you get a copy of this, the PowerPoint, and then also a link to those particular materials that I showed you and I went over today.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Therrien. This was absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. It shows your dedication to be thinking about these issues with everything that's happening in the world. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.